Hey, everybody, this is Double G from Fight Game Media. You see some other friendly faces here. We'll get to those guys in a second. So what are we doing here today? Well, this is a show that was created out of a Facebook thread that I made in our Facebook group. You can search for Fight Game Media Network on Facebook if you would like to join us. Out of my hate for the 2001 No Way Out match between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H, the idea was, what is a match that you hate that a lot of people love? And so that is mine. But we are not going to talk about that match today. We're going to talk about a different match, and we decided to bring that discussion to YouTube. So the idea behind this show is one of us, and in this case, it is the man in your bottom right-hand corner there, Jeremy Finestone, brings a match to the table that they just despise. We go over the story of the match, and then that person defends his reasoning for hating of that match. In the case that we do get a woman to join us or her point of view on a match. And then we ultimately conclude at the end of the show, is Jeremy's hate justifiable? We also made sure to do a current rewatch, so it's not just based on memories of the match. And Jeremy's pick is Mankind versus The Undertaker from King of the Ring, 1998. Now, Jeremy, where are you at this point in your wrestling fandom? And do you remember where you were when you saw this match?
I was a lapsed fan at the time. I was in high school. I had dropped out after the WrestleMania angle with Hogan and Sergeant Slaughter.
Dropped out of wrestling, not out of high school.
No, wrestling. My father was in the armed forces at the time. And it just, the whole thing didn't ring right. And I was losing interest. A lot of people dropped out at the time. And I didn't jump back in until the Royal Rumble in 2000, I believe, the Cactus Jack versus Triple H Hell in a Cell. So there was a gap in time where I began learning about the matches I had missed out, educating myself actually as someone who's peeling back the curtain for the first time ever and finding out all these things, reading the ad-ware-laden websites, not knowing where to go, and the rumors and what this and that. And I didn't know up from down, but it was such a fascinating journey to go on of what is this kind of world that I'm getting myself into. And I never left. And so there was a point where you're told you got to go back and watch these matches. You got to see this match. You got to see the Hell in the Cell. You got to see the Shawn Michaels run. You got to see the Bret Hart run. I was really only focused on WWF, WWE at the time. So I watched this match, and the first time I watched it, I was blown away. I was like, this is an unbelievable match. This is transcending wrestling kind of. I was taken in by the spell of the match, if you will. Q a few years later, you watch a few more matches, you start to see what they do to get you into understanding how a match works, getting the audience captivated, so on, so on, and so forth. And then, unfortunately, Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit died, and I realized there was a limit to what I personally enjoyed out of watching in a wrestling match. So I watched the Hell in the Cell before then those tragic events happened, and my mentality kind of shifted. And I'd watched it again after that point, and I developed a completely different opinion. It was just too much. It wasn't something that I was finding as captivating as I did once before. So that's where I ended up being when this match started.
Okay. I'm glad you stopped there.
Yeah.
Because I want you to come back after we talk about it and further that discussion. But Justin, did you watch this match live from your memory?
I didn't watch it live, but I remember seeing the magazine photo stills on Raw or whatever show it was that week. Because I remember, I was watching, I was junior high. It was like one of the heights of my fandom, especially. But I mean, WWE was getting especially hot at the time, and the idea or concept of pushing the envelope on television, not just in wrestling, but just in everything, was really peaking as well. ECW had probably caught on as much as it had ever in 98 up to that point. And it was to a point where you could see the influence that it had on the WWF stuff at the time too, especially with the Cactus Jack stuff. But I didn't see it until, like later that month. But I mean, it was just the talk of wrestling that month. Did you see Mick Foley get thrown off that cage? Did you see him go through the cage? It was definitely a turning point in whatever wrestling has become today. It's still one of those matches that for some reason people always go back to. It's always a way, I think, to pull casuals in, or to, like, even if you don't like wrestling, you got to see this because this hasn't really happened ever. A lot of people try to copy it, but I mean, it wasn't the same at all, especially because they made it feel like a big deal too. And I think, Jim Ross on the call made it really dramatic too, and it kind of sticks in your head because of his calls as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but that's pretty much where I was around the time. I didn't watch it live, but I watched it like that month. You
talk about them being big. I think the Raw after this breaks the record, whatever the Monday Night Raw, or the Monday Night record, which was previously held by Nitro. The Raw, because they did the at the end of this show, they did the title switch with Kane winning the First Blood match, and then they came back on Raw the next night with Austin then beating him in a rematch. All right, Paul, where are you at this time in your fandom?
Well, I'm hardcore fan. I'm watching every single WWF pay-per-view. I'm picking and choosing with my WCW ones, but I was a fan of both. I think we had just maybe started getting ECW at that time too, so I'm watching that whenever I can. But this in particular, I would have either been watching it at my house or my friend Doug's, and we would alternate between the two of us, and we would always get together and watch the shows, and then other friends of ours would sometimes come and sometimes not. And I mean, when I watched this the first time, it's hard to remember so far back, because I mean, literally watched every single pay-per-view for probably 20 years. I'm still watching them now, but even with him, but I do remember just being completely blown away. Not so much by the second bump, which was, obviously like the one that was the more like impactful, which we later learned it was the first one, because I mean, the first Hell in the Cell with Shawn Michaels, he went like from maybe 2/3 up the cage, and that was like incredible. We'd never seen that before. And then Mick goes right off the top, and he didn't just fall, like he was thrown. And I mean, the funny thing is, rewatching it, the cameras kind of missed it on the first one, but then they showed
they missed it big time.
Yeah, but they showed like every angle afterwards, and every single angle you saw it from, it was like a cannonball hitting the earth, like so yeah, I mean, it was, it just sticks in your mind and your memory of it. Like, I remember them fighting like for a long time before any of that happened, but when you rewatched it, like it wasn't at all how I remembered it. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was, it was, and the funny thing is like, I don't remember like having to like tell anyone, hey, you need to go watch this or whatever. It was like everybody I knew that watched wrestling saw it.
Yeah.
Within, a couple weeks. Back then we didn't have the networks, but I mean, you could get the videos, or, maybe even on the internet by then you would see clips and stuff. So.
Yeah, where I am is I don't believe I watched this live. I was watching most of the TVs live, but I am really at a busy point in my life because I am close to graduating college. I am working a lot. I'm doing an internship. I'm going back and forth from the radio station. So my actual fandom is really high. But just because of time, I wasn't able to catch everything. And that would soon change, because by the end of 98, I was able to then catch just about everything. But yeah, so, similar to Justin, I remember finding out about it and then having to go back and watch the show pretty soon thereafter. Interestingly, and this is going to be an interesting kind of point when it comes to why Jeremy hates this, but I actually like this match a little bit better knowing that Mick Foley's actually okay. because I remember having a little bit of nervousness around, gosh, we knew about concussions. Like, people will say we didn't know about concussions. We knew about concussions if you were following the NFL at that time. If you were a 49ers fan, Joe Montana had concussions, Steve Young had concussions. And so I was just worried about him physically, just wondering, like, oh my gosh, is this guy okay? And then, so, now he's, at least as far as we know, he's doing great. Maybe beat up, but at least mentally he seems pretty sharp. So I actually do enjoy it, knowing that he is better. But okay, let's talk about this. So I'm going to read you guys the opening paragraph in the Observer that came out after this show. Dave writes, Mick Foley has long since established himself as one of the greats in the pro wrestling industry, and over the last year probably solidified whatever doubts there would be as to him being remembered when his career is over as Hall of Fame caliber wrestling legend. But whatever he has done and whatever he will do within the pro wrestling business, he will always be remembered for June 28, 1998 in the match that will never be forgotten against The Undertaker in the Hell in the Cell in Pittsburgh. Okay, so as we remember, this match actually starts with Mick on top of the cage. Why was that? Well, Mick actually kind of made a mistake. This is probably the biggest mistake that he made. If you are against this match, he decided to go to Titan Towers, to go to the gym, do a little bit of bench press, brings Terry Funk with him, and they decide to watch the Shawn Michaels and Undertaker version of the match. And so Mick watches this match and he's just like, man, my current character has no heat. And we remember that he had just come off of two title matches against Austin as Dude Love. And in one, and which was going to lead to Mankind versus Steve Austin in the Cell. But because he lost twice, there was really no reason for him. And I guess in the first one, he didn't actually lose because there was the screwy finish and, with the Mr. McMahon character. But he did lose that second match. I guess, what did Austin use Vince's arm to make the 3 count or something? So I think the goofiness in those finishes was supposed to set up that third match, but the Dude Love character was not hot. Vince Russo breaks the news to Mick that he's not going to be in the main event of the King of the Ring. And Mick's like, okay, so I'm out of the Cell too. And Vince Russo's like, nope, it's you and Taker, Hell in the Cell. So Terry Funk, as they're watching, they basically agree that match is going to be hard to top. So Mick is depressed about his current heat with his character of Mankind, which they just recently brought back. And Terry goes, you know what? You should start at the top. And Mick is like, that's a good idea, because that's where a lot of the stuff, that's where the excitement was happening with Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. Now, the other thing that they were worried about is The Undertaker had a broken foot or a broken ankle at that time. He was hurt enough, and this is where Austin comes in again. Austin has a staph infection. Undertaker has a broken foot. They canceled the 2 house shows before this pay-per-view because both of those guys were in the top match and they couldn't work. Like today, they would just have the show. But back then, they were like, we can't even risk doing this because these guys are so beat up. Austin has 104-degree fever in the hospital the prior week, I think. Okay, so then Terry Funk jokingly suggests that Mankind have The Undertaker throw him off the top of the cage and down to the floor. They were kind of joking because Mick goes, oh yeah, then I can just go back up and he can do it again. And so they were having a laugh with it. And then Mick decides, you know what? That's not a bad idea. That may be the way for us to do this match. And so The Undertaker is not in on it. He actually has to talk The Undertaker into starting the match from the top. And The Undertaker basically says, he calls him Jack. He says, why are you so intent on killing yourself? Like, what is the reason? And so Mick told him, he's like, look, you're immobile. I have no heat. We can trick the fans. He didn't use these words, but this is essentially what he says. We can get the fans to think they're actually watching a good match, even though we're both not at our best. So that's the idea of what they wanted to do going into this match. Okay. Like I said, match starts at the top of the cage. Like Paul says, they missed the bump on the live viewing. Mankind gets thrown off the top of the cell through a table to the floor with so much velocity that half of his body ends up underneath the ring barrier. So half of his body is in the crowd. Foley in his book says that he dislocated his shoulder, which is what looks like if you're watching the match, because he's very heavily favoring one shoulder. Okay, now did either of you guys remember how long it felt? Like, I didn't remember how long it felt for them to actually get the match restarted. Now, this was mostly work, right? Like, the idea that they wanted to, the story that they wanted to tell was that he is too hurt to continue and they're going to end the match. Then he's going to come back and they're going to finish the match. It felt like forever. And there was a seriousness. It was a really great, and I think some of it was, Vince really thought he was hurt. Yeah. Mick got him, but he did dislocate his shoulder, and he did say he thinks he got knocked a little woozy, but that wasn't the worst one. But when you guys were doing the rewatch, did you remember like how long? Like, it just felt like time stood still. Like, Paul, did you remember that?
So for me, it was the two bumps was in my mind reversed. Like, it felt like he got up pretty quick after the first one from my memory, and then the second one, it felt like it was forever, but it was the other way around. This time, like the first bump, they were working on him for, like, I didn't time it, but it looked like maybe 7 or 8 minutes. And the second one, he was up in like a minute. Like, and that's the one that almost like literally killed him. And and he was right back up. So he's insane.
And so then they take Mankind away on a stretcher. Vince, Terry Funk, other officials are checking on him. He gets almost all the way to the back, onto the stage, and he gets off of the stretcher, very much favoring his shoulder, and he goes right back to the top of the cage. Now, the stretcher plays into the end of this match, because at the end of this match, Mick is so knocked out that when he gets put on the stretcher to go, for his own health reasons, because the match is over, he asks the ref, I believe, if he'd been on the stretcher yet. And the ref said yes. And he says, okay, I'm walking to the back because I don't want to be on the stretcher 2 times in the same match. Okay. So comes back, goes back up to, goes back up. Taker was on top of the cage and he's starting to slowly come down, but then he goes back up as well. They do the choke slam through the top of the cage, and Mick Foley falls completely from the top and down to the ring. There is a chair that follows him that knocks him right in the face. Now, in Mick's book, he says it was the best and the worst choke slam he's ever taken in his life. The worst because he didn't even go all the way up, and he took pride in his ability to get up for the Undertaker. The best because if he took the full choke slam, he believes he would have rotated right on top of his head. So choke slam happens. He says it was the only time up to then in his career that he was knocked completely out. He has a dislocated jaw. 1.5 of his teeth are knocked out, and he has a hole in his lip big enough to put his tongue through. Now, Justin, when we get to this second bump, if you thought, okay, that first thing off the top of the cage, they're working here, I get it. It looks destructive. It's crazy. But unless they sort of decided that they were going to mess with the top of the cage, that one was not part of the deal. Like, did you remember thinking that when you had watched it or watched it in your watching?
I remember feeling like, okay, the first big dive, big spot happened, and it felt like, okay, that was what they were planning to do. They were planning a huge, yeah, okay, he's going to get thrown off the cage. That's it. Move on to the next sort of thing. That's, I guess, the formula we expected in our head. At least I did. But when he kept going back and it kept kind of building on itself, whether it was either more extreme or more brutal, or just the fact that Cactus Jack, Mick Foley, just he won't stop. And that feeling of what is going to happen next, it really felt like it was building on itself. And whether it was planned or not planned, or depending on how tightly it stuck to the plan, it got to a point in the match where it felt like you couldn't really think through that fast. You couldn't process all that information. You just wanted to see what's going to happen next. What the hell is going on? And there was that that bending of like, how real is this? What happened? Is he really okay? Because that looked really bad. To having Terry Funk involved in the match too, because of where he was in his career, he was like the retired friend of Cactus Jack, which was like a real kind of, people bought into that. And him
post Chainsaw Charlie run,
post Chainsaw Charlie, it, for some reason added some kind of authenticity or something unique to the match that, like, it wasn't part of any angle. It was just, we all know that they're close and he's there helping his friend. When he got involved in the match, I don't remember exactly when, but towards the middle, and I believe that was like an audible in the match too, right?
So after Foley goes down the second time, they realize that he is not there. Undertaker told him later, and no, as Undertaker gets in the ring and he's trying to figure out if Mick is there, he tells Mick, "I thought you died, or I thought you were dead," in the middle of the ring. And so the reason why Funk comes in is to what you're saying is really to stretch the time, because they're trying to give Mick some time to recuperate. And so Funk goes up for a choke slam, and he gets choke slam out of his shoes. And Foley says in his book that as he's starting to come to, he thought it was quite odd that there was a pair of basketball shoes in the ring, and he did not exactly know why they were there. Okay, so Mick comes to. There's a spot where Undertaker is about to walk the top rope, but he actually crotches Taker, and he says that was also just to try and give Mick some time because he was not moving well. He did not feel like he was all there. He also says that in that moment where he gets knocked out from that bump, he doesn't remember. It took him a year to completely remember the match after multiple viewings, but he still does not remember the part of going from the top of the cage and then hitting the mat. Like, that's he as of the writing of his book, that part of his memory had not come back.
Correct me if I'm wrong too, because around this time in WWF, that ring looked a bit different. Like, it was constructed differently than the ones we see today. It looks like a pretty stiff ring, like looks almost like a boxing ring.
That's what he said. That's what he wrote in the book.
Yep.
He's like, it's not like the new rings. It was the old, stiff, really hard WWE ring.
They changed them after the WCW guys came in, I think.
I thought after Vic took a bump and he's like, "Fuck this shit."
Well, yeah, around that time, yeah. Well, he went off the cage like 8 months later.
Yeah. Okay, so then we get to a part of the match where Mick actually does a comeback, and he does a double arm DDT. He's got Taker in the mandible claw. He's on Taker's back. But at this point, they busted out the thumbtacks. And in Dave Meltzer's review of this match, he was like, everything was so dramatic. And then they brought out the super indie prop that he thought ruined the match a little bit. So the tacks play a part into this. Mick takes he's on Taker's back. Taker falls backwards. And Mick eventually eats the tombstone into the tacks, and he loses the match at that time. And I think it's an interesting question, which is now, Taker's hurting. He's really worried for his friend here. They got to finish this match. Mick is out of his mind because he's not quite there. But it is arguable I think, that, were the tax necessary? Probably not. The tax were there because there wasn't going to be that second fall into the ring. And they thought, okay, we had them super up in the beginning, and now we're going to bring them back in the end. And ultimately, it wasn't necessary, the tax themselves. Okay, so now we can come back to Jeremy. And Jeremy, overall, give us your reason for the hatred of this match.
Before I get to that, I have to give credit to both Mick Foley and The Undertaker, because what they did in that ring was something special and damn near impossible to pull off, given the injuries, the state of that ring, the state of the cage, the ideas behind it. Much credit to them. But that wasn't a wrestling match. That was a spot fest stunt show that was born out of the ideas of Jackass, the Attitude Era, the context, the ideas of pushing the envelope. People who come into wrestling after the fact, it's not a guarantee that that's the kind of thing that they're coming into wrestling to see. And using it as a barometer of like, hey, check this out. This is what wrestling is all about. If you show that to them, they will either expect that all wrestling is like that, which it is not, or that that is an expectation out of it. It is hard to sit there and tell people how special a match it is when you don't even have a ring bell into the match. You started out with one move 1 minute in, then you have a 5-minute break for the injury time, then you have another move. It's another 3 minutes before there's another wrestling match. You have 7 minutes of punch, kick, 5 moves by Mick Foley, and then a pin after the thumbtacks. And we're calling this art. And it's just like, give me a break. It may be art in some aspect, but it is not a wrestling match piece of art. It is an amazing work of physical brutality between two people who are hell-bent on giving fans a spectacle, winning a wrestling war, clout, pride, whatever you want. It's stupid. It's not a positive match to champion for pro wrestling. You have articles even like this week from The Star in Canada where they're referencing the Attitude Era and women's wrestling in AEW, where they had a gory blood fest, and talk about how that's not even appropriate nowadays. That's way in the past, and we should keep it in the past. Even they're trying to move away from it. At the same time, they're using that image constantly to push documentaries, images, the idea of how cool WWE is in the past. You got antique shows looking for Mankind's mask. They are capitalizing off of this thing, and it's just kind of gross. So when you're talking in the left hand and you're waving your hand on the right and telling you two different things, it's hard to come to some type of compartmentalized reality that this is, in fact, a good match, good for WWE, good to tell people to go watch, and good to keep in the lexicon and the memory of pro wrestling.
All right, Justin, what do you think about what Jeremy said?
Well, I had the initial thought was, is this or is this not a pro wrestling match? And Jeremy came out with it. I mean, it's pretty obvious that you could argue that this is not a wrestling match. But what you have to recognize, what we all have to recognize, is how important it was and is to modern pro wrestling. Even if it wasn't a match, didn't follow the typical parameters, it introduced a lot of elements about pro wrestling around the world onto the main stage, main WWE big stage. I think this was the first time I'd ever seen thumbtacks on a like mainstream level on television. That and the nuance of starting the match before the bell and just going right into it. I think both of those elements are what you would see in IWA or FMW in Japan in the 90s. It's a different flow, a different pace. And I think that's what we were seeing. And some will say that is wrestling. Some will say that's definitely not wrestling. I think in the context of what we're talking about today, if we just say a match, there are a couple expectations. We have to have a bell at the beginning of the match. We have to, and it did end in a pinfall. So semantics, technically, I guess, it was a match, but it's not like Jeremy said, it's not, if you show it to somebody, it's not a representation of what wrestling is. Not just at the time, but even now. But it is important in showing, like, a lot of elements were introduced here. A lot of people and wrestlers and entertainers that are in the industry were influenced and think about this match. Just was pivotal. Whatever it was, it changed how we approach things. Again, yeah, it introduced new elements. It doesn't matter if people like them or don't like them, but it definitely and adding to the idea we talked about earlier about Funk and Foley watching the Shawn Michaels and Undertaker match and going in with the mentality that, okay, how can we top this match? And if we go back to the Bad Blood match, 97, I think 97, yeah?
Yeah.
Like late.
Yeah.
At the time, it was pretty it was very, what's the word? Like innovative. It felt, I mean, it's what it is now, but at the time it was like, whoa, like Shawn Michaels was doing wild stuff. It felt like a wrestling match still too, right? It didn't go off the rails like this one did. And I think that's what defines this match, is that it's mostly off the rails. It's like a series of events happening around a ring that's surrounded by a cage rather than the story being told in the confines of ropes. So you can argue semantics, is it a wrestling match or not? But whatever it is, it influenced a lot of things going forward.
All right, Paul, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so first I want to say, like, because you asked, the direct question is, about Jeremy's thoughts. And the funny thing is, I was surprised when Jeremy first talked about this at the opening of the show. He said the first time he watched it, he loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like, that was the whole point of this. Like, I thought we were talking about matches that we watched and right away we hated, and then everyone else loved it, and we're trying to figure out what's the difference. Now, obviously, if you go back and with hindsight and look at some of this stuff, you're going to look at it differently. And I agree. Everything Jeremy said is correct. Like, we know that people shouldn't be doing this to themselves. We knew it back then. We know it even more now. And so, yeah, when you watch it with those eyes, you're going to think about it a little bit differently. Now, when you talk about this particular match, what we haven't talked about yet is the storyline leading into it. And all you guys didn't watch this live. To varying degrees. Garrett, you said you were watching most of the TV. Justin, I don't remember if you said you were, but I was, and I was totally into these storylines. And the storyline here was that Vince McMahon told Undertaker he lost his killer instinct.
Yep.
And Mick is trying to prove himself to Mr. McMahon. So everything in this match made sense from a storyline perspective. And that's important because, and the other thing that's important is that the match, like you said, started on the top. Immediately, Undertaker throws him off. They didn't fool around and do a bunch of spots and whatever. This was like, no, I'm trying to kill this guy.
There was no teeter-tottering.
Nope. Threw him off. And then immediately the guys are there and they're going to stop the match. And Mick's like, no, you're not stopping this match. And he gets back up. They go back to the top. Immediately, Undertaker chokeslams him through the cage. When you go back to the match 2 years later that Jeremy referenced, like Mick and Triple H, they fought on top for like 5 minutes before he finally chokeslammed him through it, or whatever he did, pedigreed him through a gimmick cage, through a gimmicked ring on an exact spot. Like, it was so contrived. Yeah. This was brutal. And this was Undertaker trying to kill him. And then immediately Undertaker drops down and he's going to finish him. And then, the paramedics are right in, and the doctors and everything, and that or masseuse guy is like working on him, and Terry Funk's in there.
That's the guy who actually pops Mick's sholdder back in.
What's his name? Henri or something, I think.
I forgot what it was.
Or Claude. I don't know. He's got a French name. But I mean, they're right in there. So it had this element of realism.
Yes.
Then when they actually did the match, like the actual body of the match, it was actually better than I remember it.
Me too.
Like, yeah, there was, like, they did a decent little 5-minute match there. Mick took like 80% of it. Undertaker was bloodied up. I didn't remember that. And they told a good story. And then when Mick brought out the thumbtacks, like, he's trying to finish him. And this was not the difference. Now, a lot of these kind of matches that I see, like, I'll go back to the lights out match with John Moxley and Kenny Omega, which I hated. Every single spot you could see coming a mile away. They set it up. There was no rhyme or reason. It wasn't like they were trying to hurt each other. It was they were trying to prove they were hardcore. Like, that's the difference to me. Whereas the second Moxley Omega match, the exploding barbed wire match, I actually loved that match because that one felt more real. That was like they were having a wrestling match in the parameters of this barbaric structure that they had built, and it felt more real. And because it was contained mostly to the ring, but then when they got to the outside, it was dangerous. Whereas the other one, it was just like all these contrived spots you could see a mile away. So yeah, so I mean, I really like this, and I think, again, we can look back on a lot of it, but we also learn from a lot of it. So what Justin said is important, that there's aspects of this that we still see to this day, and then there's aspects of this that we learned from. And as much as I slammed the contrived cage spot that they did, I mean, they learned from it. They didn't try to do try to recreate the spot that probably would have killed Mick. One thing I wanted to bring up with you, Garrett, you mentioned that Mick Foley's okay, and the fact is, I think this match took like 5 years off his career. Because
it probably did,
because he was 33 when this match happened, and 3 years later he was retired. I mean, we don't really think about that, and now he's like in his mid 50s. There's a lot of guys his age that are still going. They still do occasional matches, and there's no way Mick Foley's ever doing a match again, and if he does, he's an idiot.
Well, I mean, it's the whole reason why the Moxley match didn't happen, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Before Moxley was Moxley, before Moxley was Dean Ambrose, they were supposed to do a match and Mick couldn't do it.
And that's 15 years ago. I mean, he's what is he? I had it up here. He's 60. Yeah, he's like 53 or something. No, sorry, 57, 56. So, I mean, like Sting's 62.
So, I mean, I would say, so I think this is the one that is very clear to us. There's the Big Van Vader powerbomb to the floor where his head just conks the cement, right? That one you could say did quite a bit of damage as well. He would have, a few other matches where, the one with The Rock, the next January at the Royal Rumble, right? Where he's taken so many unprotected chair shots to the head. The I Quit match. At least this one, the pain came from, well, one, the planned spot, he did get quite a bit of kidney pain from that because that's what hit first. But the second one was unplanned and was an accident. And unfortunately, that's the one that we think probably did a ton of damage to him. Okay, so I'll quickly give my 2 cents here. The question of whether it was a spot fest or whether it was an actual wrestling match. This is a Texas death match. This is a street fight in the name of those kind of matches where today we see those match stipulations thrown around and then all of a sudden there's a lockup right in the middle, right? This is closer to what a real street fight, a real Texas death match should be like, where there's absolute 100% disdain. Undertaker hated this dude so much that he threw him off the top of the cage. So in that sense, I definitely think it's a wrestling match. I definitely think it is a fight. It is a style of a match where we feel realism. Now, if that second bump doesn't happen, I don't think the match is quite as good because a lot of the hoodwinking with the fans isn't there. Now they have to hoodwink the fans because of something real that was an accident, but that piece of it probably shaves 5 minutes off of it. They bring in the tax. I think the real drama is in trying to figure out if Mick Foley's really hurt or not in that match for the fans. The real absolute thing that gets to your heart in the match is that is a realism that cannot be duplicated again because of what happened. And no matter if you do that spot, you can't do that spot on purpose and get the same reaction. So that actually leads a little bit closer to Jeremy's point about the spot. Thankfully, or not even thankfully, but fortunate for the match, the spot is real. And I think that enhances it. But so arguments both ways. I wanted to get to the last piece here, which is.
Can I throw in? Can I add something about what Paul said that I wanted?
Yes.
I had a very difficult time, Paul, finding any context to this match. Looking anywhere to find out what the lead up was, any video packages, any like dialogue, anything, even in the pay-per-view, there was nothing. No. They just they brought these two guys in, they didn't like each other. You kind of had to figure out who was a good guy and who was a bad guy.
You probably had to go back to 96 though, right? Because the whole story starts in 96.
Right.
This was the Attitude Era and Crash TV, where there's a million things going on every show. So
yeah, it's a moment in time more than anything else. Like, you carve out this moment and then you take these clips from this and you play it ad nauseum. They played it 5 times each time in the show, and they played it a million times ever since then whenever they want to show something exciting or some clip going on about something wild. Sorry, Garrett, continue.
Okay, so I wanted to read. So the aftermath of this is, I already posted the picture here, but this is Mick. He said 14 stitches in the bottom lip with no anesthesia. Jeez. And the dislocated jaw and the kidney issue, dislocated shoulder. And I don't remember. Do we remember? Excuse me. How long he was out? Because he comes back for the main event to do the spot with Kane.
He was back the next night on Raw.
What a nut, man.
I actually saw all of these guys at a house show about 2 months later. It was in August at it was called the Pepsi Center, Pepsi Arena in Albany, New York. It's not called Times Union Center, but yeah, he was in a Falls Count Anywhere match with Vader.
Wow.
It's
Brian and Vinny, I mean, you'll do this, Garrett, on your review because you're coming up on this in a few months, but Brian and Vinny just did this a couple of years ago, and they were talking about this guy's nuts. Like, I mean, because it's the next day, and they're like, I think they reviewed the Hell in a Cell match as part of it, and this was probably the last time I watched this before today. And he came out for the main event, and then he came out the next night, and he was in angles, and and I think he might have taken a couple weeks off after the next night,
right?
Because I think they taped two Raws in a row. So yeah, he would have missed 2 weeks, but he didn't miss any TV.
So I have a question for the three of you, if that's okay, Garrett.
Yep.
Now, I wanted to know, after talking about this, and especially when we brought up, Mick Foley comes out later on this pay-per-view. So that kind of adds, it's not a part of the match, but it adds to, after the fact, we're talking about how amazing or nuts Mick Foley is. Now, my question is, would this match have had the same, if you kept Mick Foley in there, but you remove the Undertaker, would it have had the same effect? Would it have had the same flow? Did it have to be the Undertaker? Because a lot of this in the end feels like it's less of a match and more of the Mick Foley, his greatest hit in one night. And then sometimes I think, did Undertaker have to be involved? I know it's part of the gimmick, and I know it was because Hell in a Cell was his thing. There was the lead up with him, Mr. McMahon, and Mick Foley going into it. Yeah, I know that, but just in general, could you throw in Kane in there? Could it have been someone else? I don't know.
Was for the storyline, it had to be Undertaker. I mean, they could have done the storyline around Kane, but I don't think it would have been as impactful because Kane wasn't as big of a star. But at the time, they really only had 3 main eventers, 4 if you count Mick, but it was Stone Cold, Undertaker, and Kane. That was the main event scene for 8 months. It was just a combination of. I remember talking to Doug about it. This is getting ridiculous, and then they elevated The Rock finally.
Yeah, The Rock and Triple H were feuding over the IC title at the time.
Right. Yeah. Well, they were just getting to that. So it was Survivor Series before they elevated The Rock. He won the title, and then then you had another main eventer, and then it got better. But I mean, I remember just and then trying to figure out a way to avoid awarding the title because it was vacant for 3 months there for a while. They were just playing by strings because Austin was in no condition to perform at all. Garrett, you talked about that with Dave on your chat, so I think it had to be either Undertaker or Kane. And I think Undertaker made for a better story, and mostly because he was a bigger star.
I couldn't think of who you could do that match with. And Mick talks about it's he's on top of the cage, and that Undertaker music plays, and he calls it the John Wayne entrance, and that is what inspires him because he's scared up there. And and the Taker entrance happens, and he's like, okay, it's on. We got to do this. Okay. So here's what Dave writes. He gives it 4.5 stars. The last paragraph, or not the last, but one of the last paragraphs, he writes, and whether it wins match of the year or doesn't, and in some ways it probably shouldn't, and in other ways, how can you even argue against it because of the impression it created? When it was over, it was the greatest match ever that left me sad. I really wish I'd never seen it, not because it wasn't entertaining or that it wasn't a great match. It was both. I guess the final question here, in your point of view, is Jeremy's hate. And Jeremy's not playing around. Like, you can see it in his eyes. You can see how frustrated it made him to even talk about it.
Like, I don't mean to be difficult about the match. It's just like, if you want my honest opinion, I'm like, I did not enjoy watching this match. I watched it twice. I timed it the first time to see that they had 1 minute and 6 minutes on the dot. Mick Foley went down and he got up. They had it all timed out. Like, he was told to get up this is your cue, get up. He got up and he went going. And you're just like, this is a choreographed stunt show.
All right. So is it justifiable? Justin, I'll start with you.
Is it justifiable? I think, yeah. I think it's justifiable. But I mean, at the time, I loved it. And I mean, it's one of those matches that for some reason, not only because I wanted to rewatch it, but I've been in the same space rewatching it with friends. It's just one of those things that keeps popping up. And of course I enjoy it, but I do think it's justified because of how out of the box it was at the time. And it's, of course, yeah, people can like it, but it's so out there that of course people aren't going to like it either. And there's no, there shouldn't be any pressure to love something that ends up being so brutal and bloody. I mean, that's one element of pro wrestling, but you can easily have pro wrestling without those elements too. And a lot of people like that style of wrestling. You can have a great show and do something entirely different. So I understand why people would dislike it, because it goes in one direction that wrestling could go. Whereas wrestling can go in all different types of directions. It could be more violent. It could be more funny. It could be more serious. It could be more classical, whatever. But that's kind of the path that every company seemed to be at right now. Which way are we going to go? And at that time, WWF, they kind of went in the more extreme direction because that was what pop culture was all about.
And WCW specifically went the other way.
Like for a bit.
Well, Eric Bischoff got on his pedestal and was like, we are absolutely going the other direction. This is not good for wrestling. So,
which is ironic because 20 years later, Vince McMahon says the same exact thing.
Exactly.
When AEW launches, so.
Exactly.
What is old is new again.
Yep.
All right. So yeah, okay. So given the explanation that Jeremy gave, I mean, it's hard to say that it's not justified, like, because I think everyone is entitled to their opinion. I would just say that in the spirit of kind of, what we're talking about here, like, I think the initial reaction is important, and I'll go back to Jeremy's own words. He said he loved it. So I think there's a lot of matches that we could go back to after the fact and say, wow, geez, I don't like that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But like the points he made the second time he talked about it, they're legitimate, and I'm not going to downplay any of it. But I will say, like, again, looking at the time, when you were talking there and you brought up Dave, saying, I don't know if this is going to win match of the year. I went back and looked at the results of the Observer Awards that year. Mick Foley was 4th in the Wrestler of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
7th in the Most Outstanding Wrestler. Now you think to now about, like, you watch these guys, and would Mick Foley qualify now as, 7th on the Most Outstanding Wrestler?
He's got to win Brawler though, right?
He won Brawl in a landslide. Now they got 2nd place in the Match of the Year award to a Japanese match. So they were the number 1 North American match. Masawa Kabashi won Match of the Year. The 2nd place was actually Steve Austin and Dude Love. And 3rd place was Rocky Maivia and Hunter Hearst Helmsley. So, I mean, like, this match had a lot to do with all those placings, obviously. Yeah. And this was, you got to remember, in the time. I don't think you can compare it to now, because the quality of wrestling is so much better now. But I mean, you talk about even those 5, 6, 7 minutes of actual wrestling for a main event WWF or WCW match, it was pretty damn good for the time. Imagine in Japan, you know, they were doing a lot better stuff. Justin would probably be a lot more familiar with that, and maybe Jeremy too. I have gone back and watched some of that stuff, and I'm amazed at how good it is. You know, it even holds up now. Whereas a lot of the 1997, well, no, 97 was good. 98, 99 WWF stuff really doesn't hold up in terms of in-ring. But in terms of storytelling, it was amazing.
Yeah.
It was just the in-ring. It was that, and it ushered in a style that they're still doing to this day. And it feels better because they go like 20 minutes instead of 10, but it's the same, you know, same old shit. But yeah, like, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, his justifying the opinion, but I just don't necessarily agree.
One interesting thing, Paul, that you brought up about the Misawa Kobashi match is that and this could be for a different discussion, but at the time they were having great matches, but they were arguably as brutal, if not more brutal, than what we saw in this Hell in the Cell match. Of course, it's in a different way, but I could understand. I mean, they are, in my opinion, some of the greatest wrestling matches of all time. But there's definitely an argument to be made. But getting dragon suplexed on your head off of a rampway onto concrete, I think that's in there as well. Like, you know, launching yourself off a cage. It's different, of course, but the brutality is different. Yeah, and that's just another little fun fact about what we liked as fans and what we accepted. It's pretty crazy how much I mean, it was a big deal. And Mick Foley was a big deal in 1998. And then it led to the Dude Love thing, and Cactus Jack came out later. They came out with the videos of him. You remember the Three Faces of Foley cassette tape? I mean, this was also his star-making moment too.
All right, Jeremy's chomping at the bit. I can see it.
I was just going to say, when I was talking about the thing earlier about the first time I watched it, I got to give some context to this. So I'm about 20 years old. I'm in a college dorm room, and I'm seeking out matches through probably the most illegal way possible, getting these 2 megabyte screens showing me these matches, and I don't even know what I'm watching because I'm watching Jackass all the time, and then I'm seeing the people getting thrown through. So when I tell you when I saw it the first time and I loved it, it wasn't because I loved wrestling in that way. It's that it had hit a nerve, or it was already on the same wavelength of the stuff I was enjoying at the time. And when I watched it later on in the different context of really understanding, and I just wanted to make that part clear, because I totally get where you're coming from, that it's like, no, that's not the spirit. Well, there was a different context to it.
I think what you're talking about, though, is important, because there's probably a lot of people like you. I mean, if you look at the people that were watching wrestling and that got into wrestling between 1998 and 2001, it was a lot of, you know, 18, 20-year-old kids, you know, in high school or college dorm rooms getting together and watching this stuff and hooked on it. And it was the same audience that was watching Jackass. And it's the same people they're trying to get into now by bringing Johnny Knoxville back for the Royal Rumble. You know, but or watching Sami Zayn try to go over a wrestling ring in a shopping cart.
Absolutely. You'd also argue, though, like, those people didn't really stick around. So did it accomplish the mission of, like, what they were coming back to see more of? If that's what they're coming back more of.
I would say Vince McMahon owes it. Like, the fact that Mick Foley and Steve Austin and The Rock don't have giant amount of stock for enabling Vince McMahon to take this company public is mind-numbing to me. I don't even know think about it.
Mick should have like 1% for the rest of his life.
Mick should have so many shares of stock that he could sell so that he doesn't have to do anything for the rest of his life.
He could just be Santa forever.
Good for him for surviving and thriving, honestly. Like, I am so happy for that guy that he has the life that he has now. Like,
okay, so
over the moon.
I've seen Mick two times do stand up. He talks about this match a lot, and I think in part of his storytelling of it, he wants to point out how serious it was and how it was not fake, that F word, right? Well, at the same time, giving people the context of really that this unfortunate circumstance was the greatest moment of his career. and it made him as the guy, right? You could argue if this match doesn't happen, his 1999 title win also doesn't happen. It's almost like, you know, he was given the title one. He was, look, the book, you know, all that stuff, and he's over like crazy with Socko, and he turns into this comedic character. But it was almost like you know, you deserve this run here because of everything that you've done for us, more so than you're the next guy. They needed a transition, right? They wanted to do a little bit of a transition time before WrestleMania, and it worked. It was great. But the last thing I would say is Jeremy's point of the first spot being a spot, being a high spot, being something that is trickery with the fans is 100%. But the fact that the thing that really lays the groundwork for the rest of the match is the accident, that was real. And so I think that accident really makes this, like, I don't know, like the most real wrestling match I've ever seen in my life, you know? And I'm like I said, I'm just so glad that he is doing okay. And Paul's probably right that it shortened his career by a good amount. But, you know, knowing what I know about how he talks about it and seeing him talk about it has desensitized that moment for me of seeing it the first time and just being like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Because, you know, and I have to actually go back because I was a big Cactus Jack fan from his WCW run. He had a couple of different runs, like early, he had like an early 90s one, and then he was back in, like, you know, the mid 90s. But there's a move, he's called it the Nestea plunge, or somebody else called it the Nestea plunge. But I'm watching a Clash of the Champions, and it's Mick Foley against Mil Mascaris, and Mick is going to drop the elbow on Mil to the outside onto the floor, but Mil escapes and he goes into the ring. So Jack is about to do the run, and then he notices, like, oh, where'd he go? And then he looks in the ring, and Mascaris comes off with a drop kick, and Mick falls flat on his upper shoulders in the back of his head. And Jim Cornette goes, Cactus Jack is dead. And like, I was like, at that moment, I was like, oh my God, that looked too realistic, and it probably was. So my relationship with Mick Foley doesn't begin in 1998, right? My relationship with him really is like from the late 80s, early 90s. So I remembered that bump, and then seeing him go further and further and further in 98 was scary to me. But again, now that I know that it helped, you know, it paid for his kids to go to college, probably, right? I feel much better about it, because when you actually look at what pro wrestling is, which is like this dramatic interpretation of a fight or of a rival, it's actually really, really good because of that moment of realness there. So I don't agree with Jeremy. I do understand why he feels the way that he does, though. So
I think a good one to go back and look at, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, would be The Rock and Mick Foley.
Yeah,
because that's one.
I think I would vehemently hate that match if I watched it today.
Right, and yet, how'd you feel about it at the time? Like, and I remember at the time liking it until I watched Beyond the Mat.
Yeah,
and then when I watched Beyond the Mat, I'm like, I felt so bad that I liked the match.
Yeah,
because you assume it's real. And I wanted to bring up, and I forgot, like, I was going to mention it earlier, but I got my 23-year-old son to watch this today with me, and he'd never seen the match. I did bring him to the Mick Foley speaking thing years ago, and so he watched that, so he was familiar with Mick Foley, but he'd never seen this match, and he's watching it, and he's like, he's reacting to the big spots, and it's like, oh man, and stuff. And then I asked him after, I was like, what'd you think? He's like, oh, that was pretty cool. Like, and that's like literally all he said, right? And I'm like, well, were you uncomfortable? And he's like, no, I'm sure he was fine and stuff. And I think in his mind, he probably thought it was all fake.
Yeah,
you know. And did you see if you watched the premiere of This Is Us this year, and you saw Kevin watching the space shuttle explode, and he's like, no, that's not real, it's just TV.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think like, you know, like some people might have just been desensitized by all the violence in wrestling at that time. And then what Jeremy says, when you go back and realize like, oh my God, this was real.
Yeah.
You're going to feel differently about it for sure. And that's why I think like I respect Jeremy's opinion of it. You know, I made for a very interesting discussion. I'm glad we did it. I'm just not sure if it was in the spirit of, you know, like what I had in mind for matches I hate that everyone else loves. But I love this talk.
All right. So Justin Nipper does a podcast for the Fight Game Media Network with Fumi Saito called Write That Down about Japanese wrestling history. Paul Fontaine does 2 podcasts, one for the same network called In the Clinch with Ryan Frederick. It is our only UFC or MMA podcast. And he also does the Dynamite Show on our Patreon, Fight Game Media Network Plus, with Jeff Hawkins, which they talk about that night's AEW Dynamite show, and they break that down. Jeremy is a part-time participator with Keela Cash and Scott Young on the WWE show The Wrap, and he is also possibly going to be doing some other stuff with Justin Nipper on this very YouTube channel around New Japan Wrestling. Justin used to do a show called High Tension with JD Oliva that we had decided to sort of change and put on hold a little bit. And we're thinking about moving it to video. So if you're a New Japan Pro Wrestling fan, we are probably going to do something with High Tension and Justin and Jeremy, and maybe we can even get JD back. You know, it'll be a bunch of people. So I think we're going to try and make that exclusive to YouTube, though, in weeks that Justin and Fumi probably, you know, there's a bit of a time difference there with Japan. So sometimes Justin and Fumi can't actually get on a proper schedule, but we may use some of that audio in the Write That Down feed as well, especially if it's really current. So, all right, that is it. Thank you for doing this, our inaugural show, the Matches We Hate debate. We will try and do this again, and we'll have to get a Justin or a Paul match chosen for our next debate. So for Justin, for Paul, for Jeremy, I'm Double G. We'll see you when we see you. Peace out.